Hello, I'm Eric Snodgrass, Senior Science Fellow for Nutrien Ag Solutions, and in this forecast video for Farm Credit Illinois, we're going to walk through the remainder of the spring and get a good look at summer. So I hope you're caffeinated and hope you're ready to go because we've got a lot to talk about. This first picture was taken by Walker Ashley up at Northern Illinois University, and he was out storm chasing in the southern plains on Sunday, capturing just a stunning view of a massive supercell thunderstorm. And this one was pretty nasty. It was tossing down hailstones that were 5 to 6 inches in diameter. You see, this is the way this pattern's been all spring long, and it looks something like this. Since April 14th up until the beginning of June here, we have had a jet stream pattern that's favored dipping into the western United States, ejecting out of the mountains, and either taking a southerly track or a northerly track. It doesn't matter. It's been going across the U.S. out of the southwest. And this map is an important one to linger on for just a moment, because those storms like you just saw this past weekend in the plains, which are moving toward us early this week here in the state of Illinois, well, they've been responsible for putting parts of Nebraska and Iowa at their wettest springs on record. We have parts of Texas into the Louisiana region over to the Delta that have been the wettest, and also parts of the Mid-South. And the excessive rain has come at the expense of a lot of severe storms. My colleague Andrew Pritchard was out chasing in Iowa back in May, and caught this massive tornado that produced several what we call subvortices. This is a multi-vortex tornado which did a tremendous amount of damage. You may have heard about this one. It went through Greenville, Iowa, doing a lot of damage, including knocking over some wind turbines. Andrew was right there on these storms as they were going through Iowa, causing problems, just capturing in pictures and videos what the damage looked like. But if you want to think about how active of a spring this has been, it ranks second only to 2011 in our database here, and we're currently sitting at 139% of normal on tornadoes, 110% of average on hail reports, and 162% on wind reports. These are all severe wind, severe hail, and severe tornado reports. Now, I go through that quickly because it's been a wild ride, and we've seen our fair share. But this is what it also did. On the left, I have the soil moisture map from January 1st. That reflected last fall's drought. It was in the Mississippi Valley, in the Ohio Basin, in the Missouri Basin. And with all of the extremely wet weather, we have completely changed the profile of the soil with respect to its water. And this is critical because we've undone now 2 years of struggling with local drought conditions, especially in fall. So what does all of this mean as we go forward? Well, one thing to think about would be this: the Mississippi River. This is basically our western border, right? Right now, as all that water funnels down toward Memphis, it is just a hair under action stage. We're well above where we were last fall, which was deep into drought with very low water flow. In fact, we have a lot of our rivers that feed into the Mississippi currently at some sort of flood stage. And unlike a year ago where all of this in early spring was due to snowmelt, this year it's all due to mid-spring incredibly wet conditions. Now, because of the pattern that got us here, we've also watched our temperature pattern look something a bit like this. And so since mid-April up until the beginning of June, much of the Ohio Valley getting into the Mississippi Valley has been quite warm. We've stayed away from late frosts. We've stayed away from cold conditions, which means if you got a crop in the ground, it was able to jump out on this. But take note of how cool it was in parts of the Pacific Northwest. By the way, I was just on a phone call this morning with some of my colleagues there. This could be an issue with apples and pears and cherries, and also we had some vineyards in the Northwest that got hit too hard with late frost. It could be something important happening there in those particular markets. I know they don't share with us in the state of Illinois for the most part, but it's still something that could affect our grocery prices going forward. Now, let's get back to the Midwest. Take a look at this graphic. Since April 15th, you're looking at a total accumulated growing degree day anomaly map using the corn formula. And overall, if the crop was in the ground, it did have some heat to work with. If I zoom in here on the Midwest, we can see where we currently stand. So you say, well, what if I'm right here in Springfield area and I got 150 extra GDDs? What's that worth? Well, in spring, that's about 2 weeks ahead of schedule with accumulating these heat units. But the problem has been too much rainfall. And if you're just curious how much rain has fallen since April 15th, while the shading may not look too aggressive here, understand that we've got places here that have picked up just in the last, 45 days or so, 9-10 inches of rainfall. But take a look at Missouri, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Iowa. Much, much heavier precipitation at times here, and that's why their percent of normal ranges are well above 150, even in some places over 200% of average. That's double the amount of rainfall. Now, since we talked a moment about the heat, this has got a lot of people thinking just outside of Illinois, or for those folks in Illinois that have to do some replanting. If you don't get to plant your crop or replant your crop until this week, I want to let you know that throughout the Midwest, we generally see from June 7th to October 15th, which would be a typical frost date. Across Illinois, we still tend to get anywhere between 2,400 GDDs across the northern part of the state, almost approaching 3,000 GDDs across the southern part of the state. It's not really that big of an issue for us in Illinois as it might be for the western and northern Corn Belt, where if they don't get to plant a crop until June 7th, part of South Dakota maybe only gets another 2,100 GDDs. But if I kind of zoom in here in Illinois, that's how many on average we would get between June 7th and our first frost date. Okay, big picture things. This is what got us there. Now, I know there's a lot going on this slide, but you remember a year ago when it was extremely dry in the month of June and also most of May? That was all because the Bermuda high faded and split just like it did this year. See this? But this year, as that split occurred, we didn't talk about it. You didn't hear any of us going on and on about the Bermuda high, and that's because the North Pacific Ridge, one here and one here, just drove the jet stream into the southwestern United States and it erupted in the middle part of the country. Now, I want you to think hard on this, because what made that happen was all of the very warm water that was in this area. What's keeping that warm water in the area is the ridges. It's kind of like a chicken and the egg type issue here. And your biggest unknown going into summer is how cool this water gets while this water here stays warm. Now listen to me carefully, because I'll come back to this again in just a few moments. If we see this warm water filling in these gaps and just pushing toward British Columbia or toward Alaska, our drought risk in the state of Illinois drops. If this all warms up too, it drops even more. It doesn't even matter that La Nina is building. It's all about these North Pacific Ocean temperatures. But La Nina is still there and it is developing, and we've got questions about where that's going to go. In the near term, we finally shifted away from this pattern such that by the time we get to June the 5th, we see the atmosphere breaking down a trough here, building into a ridge over the west that's going to give us cooler and drier weather while the west gets all blocked up with a high over low pattern. Take a look at what the temperatures are going to do. This is over the next 5 days, and as I play this forward, this is looking out over 2 weeks, going through 5 day, like a 5 day sliding window. Watch it again. You can see where the heat is going to be. But at this time of year, when the jet stream runs over a big ridge here and dives into the Midwest, we get the cooler conditions, not cold, but cooler conditions, and we also get some drier weather finally getting to our area. Now, if I saw this same thing and it was mid-July or August, I'd tell you a whole different thing. I'd talk about lots of summer thunderstorms. Tuck that away in the back of your mind for just a few moments as well. But what this pattern's doing in the near term is this. From June 3rd to June 10th, we are still dealing with, especially here early in this week, storms coming across our area. But take note of June 10th through the 17th. This is when the ridge is in place, the flow's coming out of the northwest, the troughs of low pressure live here. There's a lingering frontal boundary to the south, and we see drier conditions. Not dry, but drier conditions. Okay, I kind of went through the first part of this quickly because now what I want to do is I want to slow down and tell you about the longer term risks. This next 20 to 30 days is critical. It's critical every year, you know that. But why it's so critical this year has been because of some of these early projections from now through mid-July. And I'm going to show you one of them. It's this forecast right here. This is the next 7 days. You've already seen it. But when I click play on this, what I'm going to show you is a 1 week sliding window from now through mid-July. And do you notice by the end of June getting into July, watch it again, we see heat building in this area. Now, why is this so critical? There's drought in Mexico. And if that drought takes over and sits here along the continental divide, we get stormy and hot. If it moves into, all the way to the west, we're then really stormy and hot. But if it slides out here toward the 100th meridian, if that's where the ridge lives, there's going to be a cutoff line, and it might be right along the Mississippi, that if you're east of it, we tend to do okay with storms, and if you're west of it, we tend to struggle. And that's going to be key to this Corn Belt precipitation pattern this summer. Now, that's just one part of it. Let me give you the other part of it. The CPC updated this on May 31st. It's their June outlook. And it's a pretty good outlook. They see most of June carrying the heat in the western United States, and I agree with that until you get toward the last 10 days of June. I think it's going to start to creep into the midsection of the country. Much of the precipitation pattern that you see here is largely what the next couple of weeks looks like. Near normal here, wetter into this corridor, but drier building out of the Canadian prairie into the northern plains. What we want to know is, what does the summer drought scenario look like? Because one thing's for certain, we're now at 12% land area in the lower 48 in some form of drought. That's D1 to D4 drought. And we don't have drought knocking on our doorstep, right? It's not right there next to us. So what we have to be concerned about this summer is not widespread drought. It's more like the flash drought kind of stuff. And that's why I was so keen to point out to you earlier that having all that moisture in the soil now could pay dividends later, even though it's given us a bit of a rough start. So let me put together my ideas for the longer range. We're going to start with Mexico. I stressed this a few moments ago, but if you look back over the last 3 months, we've had wildfires here, a lot of smoke that's moved out, and the dry conditions are likely to press their way toward the Great Basin, toward the Continental Divide as we press forward in these next few months. I mentioned this earlier, but here's a kind of a deeper diagnosis of the ocean temperatures. In Illinois, I want you to watch two things. Don't worry about La Nina right now. That's not the thing we worry about this summer. It could be in other summers, but not this summer. We need to think about these ocean temperatures. And what I want to stress is this. I put it in the box for you. If this starts to warm this whole region up, then the West has the greater risk of summer drought and heat. If it retreats and just lives north of Hawaii, then the middle part of the country, the Midwest, has the greatest risk of heat. One thing we all agree on is that the end of this season will likely be met with a very active hurricane season. So let me play out a couple of scenarios for you. If the ocean temperatures again warm into this region, the greatest risk is for a big ridge of high pressure to live here. We get summer northwest flow and a lot of thunderstorm activity. But if this retreats and the heat stays in this area, but this all stays cool, then the likelihood of the ridge setting up here in the Midwest increases. And the big problem with this whole pattern is, this whole time I've been talking, the Bermuda High is not over Bermuda. If it starts to creep its way back into the U.S., we'll be perfectly fine. But if it stays out there and stays weakened and displaced, we've got something to worry about in terms of summer drought. Now, what do the models say? The models say, fill all this in with warmer water, let La Nina slowly develop, but keep the Atlantic hot. And that is why the summer forecast from our government is not too threatening to Illinois crops. Neither is the summer forecast from the ECMWF. They've got us hotter, but they got us stormy. That's also the same forecast put up by the National Multi-Model Ensemble. Now ignore their nuclear blast of heat that their color bar represents. This is only 1 to 2 degrees warmer than normal. It just looks scary because they make it so bright and red. But they're calling for a hot and stormy summer, with the drought being here. We're going to follow this up with the forecast. It's a statistical approach here, put together by the IRI Multi-Model Forecast Group out of Columbia University. Notice the greatest heat is here, and that's where the dry risks are as well. They've got us hot and stormy. So if you pin me down today on June the 3rd and say, Eric, what do you think Illinois summer is going to look like? I'm going to tell you hot and stormy. I think that's what we're looking at. There's a lot of evidence that the ridging will return back to where it's been for most of the last 30 years, which is in the western United States. This is a 30-year composite from 1990 to 2023, so 33-year composite. And more often than not, we've had the jet stream roll over the top, try to curl around like this, which gives us those summer thunderstorms that let our crops thrive. If we don't get this, if this ridge instead lives over Minnesota, then we have to start talking about the flash drought scenario. But as it stands, every time that ridge has gone into this area, it's opened up a corridor here that's made for a lot of summer thunderstorm activity. Now let me put this kind of all together for you. Is our government worried about drought in Illinois? No. Their forecast from May 16th to August 31st suggests that if there's drought risk, it's in the western plains, in the southwest, or in the northwest. Now this can change, of course, but that's their current thinking. If I had to pick out one analog year, the year that I think looks most like in terms of ocean temperatures 2024 would be 2020. Take note, by the 4th of July in 2020, the warm water had pushed into this area. This had become less cool. La Nina tried to build, but the Atlantic was very warm where we build hurricanes. And as a result, that particular summer looked just like this. All the heat was in the southwest and west. All the drought was in the southwest and west. And there were pockets of flash drought in the Midwest. But remember that flash drought was often broken by big thunderstorm clusters, like the 2020 August derecho. Now, we are not, listen to me carefully, I'm not calling for something like this to happen. We can't predict these things months in advance. But if we get into a summer pattern that looks like 2020, it is one where northwest flow tends to produce squall lines of thunderstorms. The last thing to think about is, as I mentioned, with the warm Atlantic, well, don't forget 2020 had 30 named tropical systems. That's a record holder. We only have 21 names in our name list. And most of our forecasts right now show that if you look at what is predicted versus what average is in any of these categories, we're looking at above average hurricane activity this year. And I think it's going to move more toward the Gulf like we saw in 2020, meaning these systems can easily come up the gut of the Gulf of Mexico into the Mississippi Basin and give us some late season rains. So that is what I'm thinking right now. And I want to make sure that you're all well aware of this and just make sure that you stay on top of this forecast. I partner with Farm Credit Illinois for a reason. You're in my backyard, but I also want to make sure that I can keep an eye on this Illinois weather pattern. If you want to, you can head over to my website, ag-wx.com, to get more information in between these updates I do for Farm Credit. But with that, I'll stop it. Appreciate your attention. Thanks.